Hello and welcome to another episode on the Everyday Joy podcast. I'm your host, Joy Ravella, and oh my goodness, having a quick look at the stats, we've got quite a following in Canada and the US of A. So if you are in those areas, I'd love to hear from you. The email address is below. If you are listening from here in Australia, which part of Australia are you from? We are based here in Melbourne, Victoria. Actually, this whole podcast comes from an organisation called Positive Media. We also have a radio station that's been running for the last 20 years. It's called 89.9 The Light. I'm the afternoon show host on the station, and Joe Chapman, who you hear also on this podcast, does the drive show. In fact, a lot of the ladies and voices you hear on this podcast all work here. So there we go, some behind the scenes information for you. Today's verse, I think you're really going to enjoy. Let's get into it.
If you don't ask for advice, your plans will fail. With many advisors, they will succeed. That's Proverbs chapter 15, verse 22 from the ERV.
I have got George Pink, broadcaster, dog lover, New Zealander, and runner on the show today. George, so good to have you.
Well, thank you, Joy. It's always nice to be joining you. And a couple of days in a row, I've been introduced as a runner. I'm feeling like I should actually put that into practice.
Well, maybe that's the motivation that you need. I feel that way every time someone says, and we've got Joy here, and her name is so suitable. And I'm like, well, I was a grumpy goat this morning, so I better live up to my name.
No pressure.
So speaking of pressure, sometimes when you are under lots of pressure, you need to make some big decisions. Ari and I are kind of in the throes of trying to find a house and getting financial advice. We've come to the point where we've exhausted our own mental capacity, which is why I think this verse for us personally really applies. But for you listening, whatever situation you're facing, if you've come to the end of your own intellect, or even if you know everything about a subject, what a great verse to focus on today. Proverbs 15:22, if you don't ask for advice, your plans will fail. With many advisors, they will succeed. George, what is your first impression of this verse? And do you have any biblical context around this one to share?
Yeah, so my first impression of this one is pretty short and sharp, really. It's that there's wisdom in seeking the wisdom of others. And I think that fits really well with the wider context of this book of the Bible, the book of Proverbs, because really so much of Proverbs is about contrasting wisdom and foolishness. So this verse about wise advice, I think it sort of points to that bigger theme. So that's the big picture. But it's probably also worth saying that the specific instruction in this verse is not an isolated one. It's very similar to some other verses in Proverbs. For example, a few chapters later in Proverbs 20:18, it says, make plans by seeking advice.
So it's just doubling down on that. And in fact, George, last time you were on this podcast, episode 35, titled Wisdom is in Your Reach, it's all about how we can grow in our wisdom, why it's important. So if this episode resonates with you, also make sure you listen to episode 35 today. George, what does this verse tell you about who God is or what matters to him?
I think it tells me that he often works through people. I think that God speaks to us through wise people in our lives. And for me, that's actually quite an encouraging idea, because I think when we're trying to make a decision about something, it's easy, isn't it, to feel that we need to hear directly from God. So we need to hear his voice. Maybe we need a very clear sign, something directly from him for me. And sometimes that happens, which is great, certainly, but I think that God speaks in lots of different ways, and one of them is simply through the people around us. I think there's often a lot of wisdom to be gained just by talking to wise people we know. I think that God uses them to help us get wisdom and to be wise.
So that's a broad picture of it, and I think so, yeah, I fully agree. God often uses people to speak to us, to challenge us, to grow us, to inspire us. But how has this verse come about in your own life?
Well, I want to tell you about the time I flew around the world for a weekend. So I travelled all the way from England to New Zealand and back again for pretty much a long weekend. That's about 24 hours actual flying time. So you've got about 30-ish in transit each way. I did that there and back again in just a few days. I can see you shaking your head, Joy, but there was actually a good reason for doing that, believe it or not. So, as you know, I am an Anglican priest, and before you even start training for that ministry, you go through an official discernment process. That takes about a year. So it's you and the church both trying to work out if this is actually something you've been called by God to do. And I was going through that discernment process here in New Zealand, where I am right now, but I was going through that process in New Zealand while I was living in the UK and while I was a student there. So my interviews were mostly done through Zoom and through Skype and stuff. But the final part of the process involved a residential weekend in person back here in New Zealand. So I jumped on a plane and went home for that. But it was still term time in England where I was at uni, so it had to be a pretty quick trip. However, I think it was worth it despite the crazy amount of long-haul travel in just a few days, because it was actually about discernment. It was about seeking the will of God. It was about trying to work out what he was saying, what he was calling me to. And it was doing that with other people. So the verse we've been looking at says, "If you don't ask for advice, your plans will fail. With many advisors, they will succeed." And I think that's what that weekend was about. It was about seeking advice and wisdom from other people. And now, because I went through that very thorough discernment process back then, it's actually given me a lot of assurance and confidence that, hey, this is something that God has called me to do. So it felt very much worth it.
And I think, George, your whole experience of traveling all those hours just to get God's wisdom is a demonstration of how seriously we should take this verse. It says, if you don't ask for advice, your plans will fail. I mean, do you want your plans to fail? No, we want to succeed. And if the only thing that's really standing between you making a good decision and a not so great decision is asking the right people for the right advice, chase them down. Find a time where you can sit down with them, have a coffee, do what you can, do more than just a little Google, because there's a lot at stake really when it comes to big decisions in our lives, and you definitely want to be making the right steps forward. So George, as we wrap up today's conversation, when you were sitting on that flight coming back after you got some information and you sought wise counsel, how did it feel for you? Because you would have gone to that retreat feeling one way, you would have come back feeling a different way. So talk to me about the emotional difference having that wise counsel had on your life.
I think it felt worth it, because while it was a big effort, I mean, to be honest, I don't even really like airplane travel. I certainly don't like 30 hours of it there and back again in the space of a few days, but it felt worth it because I think that discernment and trying to work out what God is calling us to is so important. Discernment isn't something that I find particularly easy, to be honest, in my life, but my experience has been that when we seek the advice of others, when we're actually open to hearing from God through them, it does become a little bit easier to discern and to know what God might be saying for our lives.
It's incredible, George's story of traveling halfway across the world to seek wisdom, to find wise advisors to speak into his situation. It just blows my mind. And it also shows me how important it is to seek wisdom. Sometimes finding wisdom or having that conversation with someone is going to require more than a text message or hoping for your calendar appointments to align. Sometimes you've got to hunt someone down. Sometimes you've got to make it happen. Catch a flight, drive an hour or so. It might require you to step out of your comfort zone, but what an incredible gift there could be on the other side. I mean, the gift George received was confirmation that he was on the right path. It gave him peace. It gave him the sense of, okay, I know that God's in this. I've got more evidence to prove that I am on the right path. And there's nothing quite like tossing and turning in the middle of the night because you're not quite sure if the right decision you're making is actually the right decision. We also mention this word a lot, and it's called discernment. And the definition of this, the biblical definition, is to understand or know something through the power of the Holy Spirit. And I do want to stress this point. Yes, talk to wise people, but really who you're talking to is a wise person who communicates with God, someone who God speaks through. So today's application is pretty simple. If you are at a crossroads, if you need to seek wisdom in your life, go seek some wise counsel, but also make sure that the wise counsel is also being counseled by God. You're not talking to someone who's got a different value system or who believes in their own strengths and merits. You definitely want to talk to someone who's also led by the Holy Spirit. And if you do something like that, I'd love to hear about it. The email address is below. And that wraps up today's episode on the Everyday Joy podcast, Proverbs 15:22. I'll read out the New International Version. It gives a nice little spin on it. Plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors, they succeed. And that's what we want, right? We want to succeed. We want our plans to flourish. I look forward to catching up again tomorrow.